Unleash your inner demons with the help of a paintbrush in Chicory, a colorful tale. Is covering a canvas cooler with company? Chicory appropriately looks like a children's coloring book, featuring thick black lines outlining structures that are ready to be colored in. It's delightful, even if it can seem a bit messy when the coloring gets out of hand. What makes it unique is how it gives you the choice of how the world will look. Either a chaotic mess of drawings with no regard for borders, or a neat and tidy, carefully coordinated color scheme, or anything in between. The top-down view lends itself well to turning every screen into a canvas. But later in the game, when there's a heavier emphasis on platforming, it becomes difficult to recognize depth, distance, and height differences.
In Chicory, you'll be solving puzzles to navigate the map and talking to various NPCs. It has a Metroidvania-style progression system where parts of the map are inaccessible until you gain powers that open new traversal possibilities. You control your character and your paintbrush independently, using each of the analog sticks, so no matter where you are on screen, you can paint anywhere. The game never gets too difficult, but there is a steady increase in complexity as you gain more powers, and a greater emphasis on platforming. The world is laid out in a series of single screens, with hard transitions between them, and this acts as a puzzle in itself, where often you'll need to think about how to navigate to get to certain areas. And almost every screen has something to do, whether that be talking to an NPC, finding out how to navigate to one of the various collectibles, or simply coloring in the environment to your liking.
The act of painting is central to the gameplay and story. You're able to cycle through a selection of colors depending on the area that you're currently in, and paint pretty much anything you see. Painting over objects fills them in automatically, while you can freely paint larger parts of the environment. Holding down the paint button will fill an area to the borders in a matter of seconds. Many of the side quests involve something like painting a house a certain way to appeal to the owner, or helping a local business by drawing a logo. As you might imagine, it can be difficult to fine-tune a drawing using the analog stick on a controller. Thankfully, how well you do on drawing doesn't really factor into your success, and much of the actual drawing in the game is optional. Mostly, paint is a tool for navigation, both in the sense that painting is often used to open up areas of the map, and that filling a room with paint is a great way to mark that you've been there. Honestly, being able to draw on anything at any time might be one of the coolest things we've seen in a Metroidvania game, where backtracking and knowing which routes you've taken and which you haven't are necessary for progression. The map menu actually matches how you've painted each of the parts of the world, and you can draw directly on the map to mark where you want to go.
Outside this very practical use of color, painting is necessary to progress, as the game introduces elements of the environment that can be altered with paint, such as plants that grow or shrink depending on whether they're colored, or gas bubbles that you can move near rocks that explode in a burst of color and open up new pathways. Most of the challenges you'll face involve this sort of environmental puzzle solving, and we were impressed with how the game continued to roll out new challenges and new mechanics from the beginning to the end. It seemed every chapter of the game introduced a new type of puzzle, or another method of traversal, without ever getting overwhelming. Although exploration is one of the biggest elements of the game, platforming is not always a highlight. Figuring out how to get from point A to point B is generally fun, but actually getting there can sometimes be frustrating, because of imprecise jumping mechanics, as well as a top-down view making it difficult to judge depth and the difference in height between platforms. Luckily, although jumping is definitely required in some areas, it's not used that much as a primary method of traversal, and ultimately it isn't that challenging. It may just require a few more attempts than you'd expect. There's no combat outside of boss fights, and as such, boss fights feel kind of out of place. They're also fairly simple, usually only requiring that you dodge telegraphed attacks while mashing the paint button over a highlighted area of the boss. There didn't seem to be a fail state built in, indicating that they aren't meant to be much of a challenge. All that being said, they do serve their purpose as an appropriate climax for the chapters, and contribute to the game's story while adding some variation to the gameplay.
In co-op, Player 2 takes on an assistant role, playing as a second paintbrush. Player 1 has complete control of moving the main character and interacting with the environment and other characters. At least there is no prioritization over Player 2 in coloring. Both control their own equally powerful paintbrushes. Boss fights are made easier by having a second player, as otherwise they require multitasking. But Player 1 still has more to do generally, as dodging attacks is generally more involved. One or two bosses require a bit more action from the painter, but the bulk of them just have Player 2 mashing the paint button over them until they're defeated.
We admittedly don't play many of these player plus assistant co-op games, But what we enjoyed about this one compared to others is that it at least provides the opportunity for Player 2 to be active and engaged for much of the game. Player 1 is obviously prioritized in the bulk of the gameplay, but both players are equal in their potential to change the world around them using color. In many moments, like the boss fights or platforming challenges, it even makes sense to play as an asymmetric co-op game, with one player controlling the character and the other using the brush to interact with the world, attacking a boss while the other dodges attacks, or manipulating the world to create a path to a goal. The limitations are most obvious while navigating the hub areas or during long bouts of dialogue, as Player 2 cannot open the map, pause the game, or control the pace of conversations. They are able to interact with the map and other menus once Player 1 has opened them, though. It's handy to have a second set of eyes when hunting for collectibles, or identifying parts of the world you can interact with, as sometimes objects or parts of the environment can blend together if they're painted over. And while puzzles aren't difficult, the ones that require juggling multiple tasks or timing are made easier with a second player. And of course you can discuss the solutions to some of the thinkier puzzles. Even if the second player usually has something to do, ultimately they're just a paintbrush. There's no exciting progression of powers like Player 1 gets to enjoy, and exploration from their point of view is mostly passive. If Player 2 gets bored quickly, generous checkpoints make it great for short sessions, and players can easily drop in or out.
You are the loyal janitor in the home/office of your favorite artist, Chicory, who's responsible for maintaining color in this food-themed town of anthropomorphic animals. When all the color drains away and you find that Chicory has abandoned her position, you take up her magical paintbrush to make your own mark on the world and figure out why the town is being overrun with spooky trees. Chicory's story tackles pretty serious themes for a game that looks like it was made for children. Characters struggle with depression, self-worth, and the consequences of turning their passion into a job. Eventually, it will have you questioning the very nature of gameplay in a setting where saying yes to every little task feels like what you need to do to progress. The game does a great job at establishing and maintaining a sense of community. In every hub, you're likely to see several familiar faces among the dozens of characters you can interact with. In short, Chicory's story is excellent, and a highlight in a game that is full of highlights.
We occasionally got stuck in the environment and couldn't escape, even after restarting the game. Luckily, there's a button hidden at the bottom of the options menu that teleports you back to the game's first main hub. It's not the best solution, and it took some researching online to discover it, but at least it's there to keep certain bugs from breaking the game.
Near the 2/3 point, the game began to consistently crash on our first attempt to start it each session, which meant wasting time to start it up again every time we tried to play it. This issue got worse and worse as we got closer to finishing the game, eventually crashing multiple times in only an hour or so of playing, to the point that we were afraid we wouldn't be able to finish. We assumed this had something to do with the game having to keep track of everything we've colored in. Luckily, we were able to finish it, but we had to neglect some of the side activities for fear of the game collapsing under the weight of paint.
Despite technical issues, and less interesting co-op gameplay, we really enjoyed Chicory. Its world is well realized and inviting, with plenty of unique characters that act very organically. The gameplay for Player 1 changes up frequently enough that it never feels stale, and it allows a second player to be engaged most of the time. Because technical issues hampered so much of the last third of the game, and because the co-op does feel limited, we can't fully recommend the game. But for the unique Metroidvania experience, the awesome story, and the inclusion of a not completely passive co-op mode, we'd give this one a soft recommend.